Today we have a quick discussion of art in Spain. So the general term for this time period is called Hispano Moorish. Hispano obviously is Spain, Moorish represents North African artistic styles. We've already looked at Cordoba before, and that obviously was during the Umayyad period in Spain. The government in Cordoba ended at around 1090, the end of the 11th century, and various dynasties started to take over those areas within the Iberian Peninsula under the control of Marrakesh in Morocco. So Morocco was more or less the capital of that far western empire, and Spain was one of the outposts. So today we're going to look at some Moroccan examples as a lead-in to some of the most famous of all of the tourist attractions in Spain. So I want to just review a couple vocabulary words. So Mudéjar is the name of the artistic style that was used in Islamic Spain from the 12th century onward. Mudéjar also has an element of being plaster work, so a high level of craftsmanship and detail work that we saw was very typical of Islamic cultures in the last couple of lectures. Now, last time I introduced an architectural form in the Iwans of the Persian art, those little concave curves like stalactites within a dome. We saw in Persia, we saw in Central Asia, in Samarkand and Bokhara, that when you have these large domes, especially the entryways into buildings, these gateways, portals, that in the underside, the artist decided to decorate those as well with very high three-dimensional reliefs. Abstract in concept, but like these little cups, upside down cups, concave forms. They give a sense of back caves, stalagmites, however you want to describe it. But that becomes even more synonymous with Hispano Moorish, with Moroccan and Spanish Islamic art during these various periods. So I'm going to begin with showing some examples from Morocco. A few of them survive, mostly minarets that were attached to various mosques. Very few of those original mosques survive in their entirety because they were subject to renovation, rebuilding over the centuries. So very little survives from this time period of the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s. But as we see in this side of a minaret, that it is very much, it's not as much brickwork, it's more stonework, but that same concept of enlivening the surfaces of the buildings with this high relief decoration that creates a tremendous amount of light and shadow play and contrast between the pale sunlit surfaces of the buildings with those shallow depths that create a very vivid shadow contrast. Again, the decorative vocabulary is what we saw before. It's a combination of the geometric, very clean lines, clean shapes, horizontal, verticals, ruler and a compass, very clean geometric elements with the more organic, vegetal, Arabesque forms that we've seen before. So it's like a hybrid, a combination. But again, in this part of the world, they're not relying on the ceramic decoration for the surfaces like in Iran and Uzbekistan in order to give visual variety and contrast. It is mostly in Morocco and Spain the introduction of this low relief that still in the Spanish and Moroccan sunlight gives a tremendous amount of visual contrast. Here we have another minaret. Obviously what you see in the foreground are the original columns, pillars of the mosque, obviously no longer surviving. In this case, we do have at the very summit an introduction of some blue tiles. So here we have a detail very similar to the last example. So here the blue against the pinkish orange stone creates a very good contrast. Again, just as in Persia, it's not a real blue and a real red. It's these half tones, these pastel shades that are so subtly worked that they still very beautifully work against each other and create a very nice contrast between warm color, which here is represented by the stone, that warm pinkish, reddish, beigey type of stone, very typical even here in Armenia, as well as that aqua blue, that turquoise blue. So it's a half shade of pink and a half shade of blue. That really creates very nice contrast. So not only on that wall surface of that minaret, the blue is this like four-sided plant form, leaf form, but it also looks a little receded into that wall surface. So you have foreground, background, as well as warm color, cool color. So there's a lot going on, as we said before, even with a very limited visual vocabulary. So you have the big block on the bottom, then you have like 3 windows. It's the horseshoe arch that we saw in Cordoba before during the Umayyad period. Then we have these like decorative arches that look again very much like the Cordoba style, that scalloped, very highly decorative shape. And then this geometric patterning becomes a surface pattern. 2 windows up higher that end up looking, in my mind, it looks like 2 eyes, and the open doorway beneath looks like a mouth. But anyways, and then we have our geometric bands, like a geometric checkerboard type of form between blue and white. And then we have another horizontal line, and on top of that is those little ziggurat, triangular, stepped pyramid forms, like from the fortifications, going all the way back to the Abbasid period. So it's a recreation of old traditions into new formulas. So these Islamic artists are trying to always put a new spin on an old melody. And that's what you see. But the fact that each of these buildings is so distinctive shows how successful they were. Now, the most famous building that we have in Spain from the tourist perspective is the Alhambra. The Alhambra is a palace located by Granada, Spain, and Andalusia, which is southern Spain. And this was the headquarters of that little principality that's of Islamic principality that still survived in Spain even far into the 1400s. So there were still people here, still an Islamic state here in 1492 when the Muslims were finally chased out of Spain. It is called the Red Castle or the Red Fort, again because of the color of the stones. But it is located on a little hill overlooking the city, and as you can see, a very picturesque setting. It was a pleasure palace. It is not a city. It was a pleasure palace for the princes, as well as we'll start to see, a scientific proving ground for hydraulics and botany and other elements that deal with technology in agriculture. Now, again, there's appropriation. This palace was abandoned in 1492 when the Catholics took it over. They took it over, they appropriated it. Obviously, the gardens were beautiful, the buildings were beautiful. They didn't destroy it. There was no desire to destroy any of it, just like we saw in the mosque in Cordoba. They just built their church in the middle of the mosque and kept the mosque as it was. So here in this slide, we see this courtyard built by Charles V when he took over the palace at the beginning of the 1500s. So he actually used this as a country estate. as a weekend home because it is so beautifully situated with the gardens and the fountains. So this is, again, the Catholics taking over the Islamic building and introducing, literally in the middle of the Islamic palace, introducing a very Renaissance style building. So the Alhambra is two parts. One is the residence and one is the gardens. And people like just to stroll about the gardens. And this is a typical view of what you will encounter. So large pools of water and palm trees, beautiful plantings. Here you see that everything is very neatly manicured. Everything is geometric and very carefully controlled. Nature is not allowed to be nature. Nature has to be modified into a geometric pattern. That's very typical of many societies, including Renaissance society. So what you see here actually is extremely close to the way it was in the 1300s and 1400s. So it's very open air in order to maximize the flow of the breezes, especially during the summer months. So it's very open air. The buildings are very open. There's no glass, no windows. So it's more of a pleasure palace, a recreational site. The gardens of the Alhambra, as I said a moment ago, focus very much on new technologies in order to enhance agriculture. It was one of the largest hydraulic works locations in the world at its time. Not just fountains for the sake of fountains, but experimenting with irrigation technologies, because this involves many acres or hectares of land. It was very important for all the plantings to be very well watered. And due to the fact that the Alhambra is placed at the top of a hill, the hydraulics had to be specially designed in order to pump the water up from the lower level of the rivers in the city all the way up to the summit of the hill. So way back there would have been fountains, water would have been moving, the pools would not be as stagnant as we see in this slide. So here we have water moving, active water. Again, all the hydraulics that are operating these fountains today are 500 years old or more than 500 years old. And that's one of the marvels of the technological system. Besides a focus on water and fountains and engineering, there was also a very strong emphasis on botany, on the plants. So originally at the Alhambra, there were samples of all the plants of the Islamic world. So it wasn't like a seed museum, which there are some today, places where scientists keep seeds from buildings around the world just to safeguard them. But it was something like that. So you have plants from all over the Islamic world that obviously this is the far western edge of Dar al-Islam, all the way to Persia and Afghanistan and India and further beyond. So it was a place for study. It was a place for scientific experimentation. So they could understand better the natural world and how to cultivate it and use it. So here we have another image of the gardens. Again, it's just a pleasure. It's science and also pleasure. So there's no symbolism here. Okay, there's absolutely no symbolism. There's no story here. It is just an example of the aesthetic refinement and sophistication of these architects. So what are the very common walkways? One of the problems when you go into the gardens is you get lost very, very easily. You could end up wandering for hours and hours and lose any sense of where you are in relationship to the palace itself. It's Not a maze for the sake of being a maze, but because the gardens are subdivided into so many separate units, those that are agricultural, those that are botanical, those that are flower gardens, those that are more about the fountains and hydraulic engineering, that you get lost in the variety. So let's look at some images of the palace itself. So water obviously is a very important element for the desert dwellers. And if you know, if you've been there, southern Spain is extremely arid, very dry. It's not a desert. There's still as much agriculture there, but it is that type of very hot, unbearable summer. So water obviously is an essential part of creating the palace environment. So here you see it is a couple rooms, then you have a courtyard, then you have a few rooms, then you have a courtyard. So it is this constant shifting from inside outside, from sunlight into darkness, from a watery environment into a dry environment. So there is always a sense of surprise because the visual images, the room sizes are not consistent. They keep changing with various levels of decoration, ornamentation, and shape and size. So here we have a view. We're looking out of a couple windows in one of these rooms, looking out into the gardens. So here it looks very similar to what we had in the Seljuk time period and early Persia, that sense of hoar vacui on the surfaces. Clearly in a very arid climate, that while Spain in the winter, once in a while they do get snow, there is water, but one way to safeguard and preserve a building is the ceramic tiles. So they do protect it. They're easy to wash, they're easy to clean. So whether there's mold or whatever the case may be in a building over time and with fluctuations in the temperature and humidity, ceramic tiles are very functional. But obviously they also give an opportunity for a tremendous amount of visual delight. So you have the ceramic tiles on the bottom half. That's pretty much standard here. And then up above, it's pretty much the same decoration as in the Seljuk. It is the combination of the arabesque, that vegetal vine form, interweaving, interflowing. You have the geometric, horizontal, vertical, and some clean shapes. And then you also have script. So even in this room that is not of a religious function, you still have script going in bands up from all of the columns. And then, even with those shallow recesses, those little shallow, I don't want to say a half dome, but that over the window, you have those plaster macarnas, those plaster little stalactite forms to give even more decoration. Now, maybe it looks like it's too much. The artist overdid it. But the fact that there is no color in the wall surfaces, there is no color in the ceiling. It's all one color. It's just sgraffito, inscribing, engraving into the plaster wall, or adding on more plaster. It's all one color. So therefore, you don't get that sense of being visually overpowered. This is perhaps one of the most famous spaces of the Alhambra Palace, and that is the courtyard with the lion fountain. So the lion fountain is obviously a circle. You have the lions around, 12 lions. And then you see it's a geometric disposition. It's almost like in the center with east, north, south, and west. And then you have gateways or doorways on each of those four sides. So again, it's about creating a beautifully conceived and geometrically perfect garden. So here we're standing a little farther away We are standing in one of those covered porches. Again, it's that same Islamic concept. You have your open courtyard, then you have your columns that produce shelter, shade. So the sun versus the shade. It's the same thing as Muhammad's house, going all the way back, a consistent architectural element in all Islamic areas. So here we're looking into the courtyard, and you can see the beauty of the columns all the way around. A little bit of variety there, but again, the color creates the greatest sense of consistency. So you see on the wall surface all of that beautiful layering of arabesque lace-like designs. In some elements, like above those trio of columns, it's more of a flat carpet pattern. But over the single columns, it becomes much more three-dimensional, much more vigorous, with some of those macarnas, some of those stalagmites hanging within. So look at how many different shades of beige or brown you have within that image. Even though the wall is all the same color, you have a variety of different visual impressions because of the bright, bright sunlight to only a little bit of light, all the way to no light. So it's actually light that is the animating surface. We talked about light as an animating surface. That is the light of God, the light of Allah. So here you can see how that light really makes the surfaces come alive. And we have to think of buildings as something that can be alive, something that can be active. Here we're looking inside of a dome. There are a couple chapels because they're really not mosques. They are religious rooms, prayer rooms that are for the royal family, the princely family. A mosque is that communal assembly hall. You don't have a communal assembly hall in a private house. So therefore, it's scale-wise much smaller. They just call it a chapel. But here we're looking up at the dome. It's like we're almost, craning our necks upward in order to look at the very top. It's hard for me to give you dimensions because it's very hard to judge the distances within this. But you see how much the wall surfaces have been activated, how lively they are. It's like you have balconies by the windows, but there's nothing under those balconies. It's stalagmites. So it's like the space underneath the balcony has eroded away. Almost looks like it has corroded away. It erodes away, so like the balcony is suspended in the air with absolutely nothing underneath it, nothing supporting its weight. And that sense of that stalagmite, where the underside of a wall or a floor is dissolving. You see that in the ceiling here. You see it in all surfaces. When you're there in person, it's amazing. That's why this building is known worldwide as one of the most important architectural sites. Also the fact that it's all original. None of this is reproduction. There are some areas that had to be renovated because of all the human traffic. I went first, this is going to date me. I first went there in 1969, and back then you could touch all the surfaces, everything was very accessible. Then I went back in 1996. And in that year, all the walls were covered in plexiglass, so you couldn't touch them. And various areas were roped off, so they were no longer accessible to tourists. So that just shows the damage that a high level of tourist traffic can do to a building. This is all plaster work. So therefore, there is a sense of delicacy there to begin with. So here we have a wall surface. And again, it has many of the same elements that we saw in the mosques and the minbar and the mihrab arches in various places. But they're at the top of the wall. You have those odd shapes of the makarnas. So the advantage of going to the Alhambra is you can see all of these decorations very up close. When you go into a mosque, you need to, you want to be respectful of people's spaces and respectful of the building because, mosques are still functional places of prayer. There are some mosques that are simply museums, but most are not. But at the Alhambra, so you want to keep your distance, you want to keep respect, you don't want to act like a tourist and intrude upon the people using the structure. But in this palace, you can really get very close and see a tremendous amount of detail. So you see here the elaboration of surface versus background through the relief carving and the variety of some areas that are just, flat, smooth, and other areas that are carved, sgraffito, engraved, even more so. So you have a tremendous amount of contrast and, as I said, visual variety. So here we see some of the walls that have ceramic on the bottom with the decoration, the plaster decoration up above. And generally the places that have ceramics, tiles, are those that have water because maybe splashing or various functions, they were using the ceramic tiles in order to make the room more easy to clean. So here we have more detail of some of the ceramic tiles. It looks a little bit like waves, dolphins, fish. And then as you see up above the top zone within the ceramic are those little fortification, those little step ziggurats that we've seen for now, hundreds of years. So again, an adaptation of various visual elements from even religious architecture. Good design is good design, and if it's good in a mosque, you can use it in a palace. And here we have an image a little closer up so you can see the actual ceramic tile work. So each little, it's not like squares of tiles that are then painted. It's more of a mosaic where each color is fitted into, like a puzzle, fitted into the overall design. So that shows even more so the tremendous level of work. One detail I want you to see within this example, look at those white lines that outline and interweave the entire image together. In some cases, you see the white line goes underneath, some cases it goes over. So obviously it's not going over and underneath, it's just the way the various pieces are cut. But it gives even a greater illusion of three-dimensionality and some of that basket weaving that we saw during the Seljuk, that illusion of lines going under and above each other for that sense of interconnectedness. So I want to end today by looking at another building. So southern Spain obviously has many very good Moorish, they call it, Moorish buildings remaining in extremely good condition. So we've seen it being adopted for the Islamic palace. But as I keep saying, good design is good design. So here we have a building, not in Granada, but in Toledo, Spain, which is north, much closer to Madrid, so more in the center, geographic center of the country. And this is a synagogue. So this is a Jewish place of prayer. So from the outside, nothing very distinctive. Now it has a cross at the top, of course. Spanish Inquisition. So in 1492, all of us in the United States know that year because that's the year Columbus sailed from Spain to the New World. But 1492 was also the year that the Spanish monarchs expelled the Muslims. But it also was the time of the Spanish Inquisition. So the Inquisition, on a larger part, was to expel all heretics, all people who did not believe in Catholicism from the country. So first they got rid of the Muslims, and then they got rid of the Jews. So the Jews were expelled from Spain in the 1490s into the first decades of the 1500s. And many of them ended going northward. Well, some went to Morocco, so Morocco was relatively safe. Some went to North Africa, but a vast majority of the Jews living in Spain and Portugal ended up going northward, and that's when you have the vast migrations of Jews into Germany and Poland, where they stayed until the 20th century and the Nazi extermination. So let's get back to this building. So here we have a synagogue. Outside, nondescript, nothing very unusual. So let's go inside. So this is the synagogue. And when you look at the far wall in this image, you see all the Islamic elements. Those are Islamic arches, just like in the Mosque of Cordoba. There you have a wall decoration of that two-dimensional design that's a combination of geometry, arabesque, and you even have script. If you look very closely, you have your three arches and like a carpet pattern above it, very elaborate hor vacui, and then you have that frame around it for the geometric around the organic carpet pattern. Left and right, you have two zones, vertical zones. At the bottom, you see like a square with a circular form at the top in a contrasting color of the stone. That has Hebrew script, and that represents the Ten Commandments and the Torah. Up above, you have another horizontal line with more three-dimensionality in the plasterwork, and above it, that series of columns and arches, just as we saw a few moments ago in the Alhambra Palace in Granada. As you see, some of the wall surfaces have been reconstructed. So you see areas that are very solid and plain are those that have been fixed and renovated. So just look at the areas that are highly decorated. Those are the original back to the 1400s. But there are two synagogues in Toledo. Both of them have obviously were created, designed by the same artists who designed Islamic buildings. Artists don't have any religious affiliation. They just are hired to do jobs. And therefore, you could have an artist one day working on a Catholic church, the next month working on a synagogue, and the next month working in a mosque. That would have been very typical in Spain or Morocco or North Africa during these centuries. But it shows again how styles are transmitted, how they flow, and it's seen just as design. It's not seen as Islamic design. And so it's not invested with any political or religious overtones. It's simply seen as art. And I think that is a very positive statement about this whole aspect of art history during these centuries. It's seen as art and the level of sophistication and technique, and it's not seen as political propaganda or some other type of social declaration. Now, appropriation is a political thing, but in terms of here in design and the artisans and the ornamentalists, they can easily move from one context to another with their very high technical skills. Okay, so that's all we're talking about today for Hispano Moorish. You'll see, you'll go one of these days, you'll go to Granada, you'll go to Cordoba. So it's very good to have these buildings on your to see list so that you can get the experience in person. Okay, thank you.